I'm Stephen Bernstein, Global Chair of McDermott's Health Industry Practice Group. I'm pleased to present our monthly podcast, Governing Health, geared towards director education. The goal of this series is to supplement the education that directors receive in the boardroom by providing them with concise updates on leading developments and engaging conversations with industry guests that relate to the exercise of their fiduciary duties. On behalf of the Health Industry Practice Group at McDermott, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Hello again, and welcome. I'm your host, Michael Peregrine. We're pleased you're with us. Today's conversation focuses on an extraordinary challenge to effective governance, the dysfunctional board. It's a CEO's nightmare, it can create enormous threats to the organization, and it can expose contributing board members to personal liability. Now, the duty of loyalty doesn't mandate that the boardroom be the functional equivalent of Switzerland. And between the board and executive leadership, there's that whole constructive skepticism thing. But the law does impose certain expectations regarding cooperation, respect, and order. For example, the board is expected to organize the business and maintain the collegiality of the board and its committees to help assure that the board agenda is achieved. The board is also expected to foster a truly collegial relationship among and between senior corporate executives and board members in support of the board's dual role as strategic partner and as monitor. But that doesn't happen all the time, and that's what's prompting today's conversation. And I can think of no better person to lead us through this issue than my good friend, David Nygren. David and his firm work with client executive and governance leaders on a range of issues closely connected to both clarifying the strategy and linking to key initiatives to ensure its success. David advises both Fortune 500 and nonprofit clients, including many prominent nonprofit health systems. And what makes David so special is that, as his resume suggests, his work is firmly rooted in an understanding of human and organizational behavior. And in dealing with dysfunctional boards, I can't think of any more necessary qualifications. But before we turn to David, and in our regular Left Out segment, let's revisit a discussion from our January episode that remains very topical. In that episode, I talked with my partner Eric Zimmerman about the board's obligation to be informed about healthcare reform initiatives. Well, as we all know, the last several weeks has demonstrated a tremendous amount of activity in that area, and I've asked Eric to come back and speak with us today about what's going on. Eric, I thought healthcare reform was dead, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think that is overstatement, Michael. I think the bill that Congress was considering last month was killed, but the reform effort and repeal effort is not dead by any means. So boards, in my estimation, should continue to be focused on congressional activity around repeal and replace with the same level of energy that we talked about back in January. I think that Congress is absolutely going to revisit some kind of repeal and replace package, and while it may look different from the bill that we were evaluating back in March, I think that we will see some measure go forward and a measure that will could have a comparable impact. Moreover, I think boards need to, as we're talking about repeal and replace, keep their eye on activities in the administration, because the administration itself is at a crossroads in terms of what it wants to do with the existing exchange marketplaces and with Medicaid expansion. The administration needs to take steps now within the next several weeks and months in terms of shoring up the exchange markets or letting them crumble down among their own weight. And which path they choose is going to be of critical relevance to the healthcare sector. So keep your eye on regulatory developments coming out of the administration with respect to the exchange marketplace, and whether they try to, through administrative action, give states more latitude to modify their existing Medicaid programs. Finally, I believe we touched on this back in January, Michael, but I think it continues to remain a concern, and that is Medicare reform. Separate and apart from the conversation about ACA repeal, there are many leaders in Congress who want to tackle entitlements more broadly and have talked about revising the Medicare program in substantial ways. Even though that's politically difficult and maybe less likely now given where things are with respect to repeal and replace and the amount of calendar that has been chewed up in the meantime, we nonetheless could see substantial changes to Medicare, including provider payment cuts, and those could have significant impacts on health systems. So that also is something for the board to concentrate on.
So I guess the core message is to keep those healthcare reform updates on the board agenda for the foreseeable future.
I would absolutely keep them on the agenda, keep the focus in the same place, and keep the same level of effort in that focus.
And now let's turn to our friend, Dr. David Nygren, who's joining us from Los Angeles, and our discussion about dysfunctional boards. David, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's delightful to be here.
Let's start with a basic question. When it comes to board culture and performance, what does dysfunctional mean to you?
It's a great word, Michael. It's often misused. It basically refers to some of the nonsense that happens in the context of our boards and broadly in governance. It's oftentimes a word used by, say, a chairman or a CEO or the general counsel to describe the fact that the board is actually not adding value or it's derailing value in some instances. I've heard the following types of comments it's along the way. My board is an aquarium of dead fish, which for us is not a very good image of life-giving contributions of board members. Or I've got a huddle of quarterbacks where nobody wants to play team sports. Sometimes I've said that the board is asleep at the switch, or the CEO might say, here comes trouble, or this is how things get done around here. If you hear the statement, I have a nice board, that's probably the least positive thing you can have said about a board. All of these terms refer to a sentiment of dysfunction or poor performance, and there are a lot of causes for that, which I'd be happy to drill into.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess when we talk about this, I'd be interested in your experience about what are some examples, not only on an individual director perspective, but also whether you see dysfunction arising from a clique or a large group of directors where I think there would be a tremendous problem.
Well, it can break that down, Michael, into looking, first of all, at persons, dysfunctional persons. And we all know one when we see one, but it's sometimes hard to articulate what the problem is. A dysfunctional person or a person who is somewhat confused in their governance role may have limitations of awareness. They may not be on the information circle. They may have sometimes bad intent. They may be in the position of a governing director or a trustee without a full awareness of the duties of care and loyalty. So when you deal with individuals, we're talking about a lack of insight or personal awareness, and sometimes it's a lack of emotional maturity. When you look at groups or subgroups within the board, sometimes you see that groups don't understand the larger context within which the formality of boards actually really matters. When you talk about the duty of care, we're talking about the discretion that one commits to when overseeing the institution's life. There can be subversive forces within the board itself. There can be small groups who think that they know better than the board or the CEO or the chairman of the board. Sometimes we see subversion played out in small groups or through individuals that causes damage to the harmony within the board. Now, there is an addition to persons and groups. We can also have structural flaws that cause dysfunction. That structural dysfunction can sometimes be reflected in the anxiety that people feel or the failure to function effectively. And just to give you a couple examples that I'm quite familiar with, one would be committee charters that are not specific, or perhaps they have overlapping duties. It's not clear what the audit committee does, what the finance committee does, or what an executive committee might do versus what a governance committee might do, or what the lead director might do versus the chairman might do. Lack of role clarity creates a great degree of dysfunction. Executive committees that are not duly authorized by a full board can often be problematic when they're swimming in a committee's lane when they really ought to be trusting the full board process and work through the CEO. And then finally, another way of thinking about this is that a structural problem can be that the board itself is not educated into its real role. And we often assume that individuals who join boards have been oriented, educated, or somehow experienced in governance, but as we all know, there's not as much education in governance as is required to be effective.
David, let's take advantage of your experience and look at some of the root causes here and look at the history of dysfunctional boards. Is this something new, or is it something we've lived with for a long time and is now popping to the surface just because of the pressure on these folks? They're overboarded, or the burdens of the board's agenda are starting to squeeze them in ways that they're not prepared for. What have you seen, and what's your perspective on this?
I think risk and compliance are increasing. I think the regulatory climate is intensifying the focus on boards. I think that boards are now fully aware that they have duties for which they may not be fully prepared. I think as well that bylaws and roles and charters are sometimes either not clear or not fully implemented. People get confused and they don't necessarily go back to the bylaws or ask the general counsel for guidance. And sometimes there's just either old-fashioned or out-of-date notions of what the governing role is. There's another dynamic where, as I said earlier, either executive committees are overreaching or not allowing the full board to function, and we see executive committees moving more towards their own authority or empowering the full board. But there has to be a dialogue about that, because in my evaluating of boards, most often where executive committees are overreaching, boards are dissatisfied. And then finally, I would say that we see more personality dents that are becoming more evident to us, whether that's someone's self-indulgence or their narcissism, their arrogance, the power plays, or they just don't exert themselves properly within the board with a mature self-awareness, and so they're more disruptive, perhaps, than they've been in the past.
Let's take that a little bit further, because you used in your comments a few minutes ago the word subvert or subversion. Is it possible to classify the areas of dysfunction in between what I would call soft dysfunction and hard dysfunction, where the root cause is more a lack of understanding as opposed to a real desire to create friction or to be a subversive force within the organization? What is your experience?
Well, sometimes there is, said in a positive way, a marginality of view or a minority view that deserves to be cited and called forth. But sometimes there is a subversive view where people have either a pre-baked agenda or perhaps even someone has been prescripted before coming into the boardroom by the CEO or by a committee chair. And so it can become subversive when not disciplined. And I think that the spirit of collegiality or consensus building or inquisitive deliberation often gets short-circuited by people who want to control the outcome of the conversation. Or the flip side of that is the temperament or the culture of the board is so collegial that it doesn't want to call out either negligence or compliance errors or poor reporting or even a dominant CEO or chairman of the board. It can be very disruptive to the consensual knowledge and awareness of the board driving towards a careful decision. So all of these dynamics, both of personal dysfunction or group dysfunction or pre-baking the agenda and then planting someone in the room to subvert the core conversation, can be problematic.
So can being too nice of a board be dysfunctional?
It may be the worst, Michael. It may be the worst dysfunction. Being too nice, dysfunctional politeness kills a lot of good decisions, and we can overtrust either CEOs or committees or even overtrust our own leadership within the board. The reason we come together as fiduciaries of a board is to act in good faith and with good intent towards the common good and allowing the common good to be expressed by the application of every form of question, intellect, and idea within the boundaries of what good governance would encourage us to do. Now, you can have incursions of failed oversight that happen when you overtrust or undertrust. As an example, pay is often an example of an area that is problematic for either boards or CEOs. Sometimes overpay, excessive pay, can be very difficult to restrain. Sometimes if we have a kitchen cabinet that is pre-baking ideas before it comes to the full board and driving an agenda, it's hard to raise a contrary opinion. And so I think as we think about failed oversight, it's usually either people are being dysfunctionally polite or there's a subversion that is intended to drive an agenda through a board process. And my bias is really to engage the board reflectively in its own duties as thoughtfully as possible. And that's the job of the chairman, the governance committee, and the general counsel and the CEO to collaborate carefully in the agenda, the sequencing of important conversations, and then really allowing the group to deliberate. One of the short-sighted actions that we often see is an agenda that is too packed, strategic issues that wait until the last 5 minutes of the board meeting before the hard issues get to the table. And I really encourage chairs and CEOs to work to build a deliberative agenda that allows the full board to be engaged early in the meeting with the most pertinent issues.
Let's pivot for a moment to our regular short segment, What's Trending Now, when we try to flag for you a new governance issue we see on the horizon. And today, that's certainly the increasing board focus across all industry sectors on protecting the company's culture and reputation. It's something the business media is noting. For example, Wells Fargo has created a new corporate responsibility committee, and the board leaders at Uber have taken a prominent role in shaping that organization's response to certain alleged cultural practices. In addition, the National Association of Corporate Directors just announced that its 2017 Blue Ribbon Commission will be examining the role of the board in overseeing its organization's corporate culture. Thus, how the board oversees corporate culture issues may be an appropriate agenda item at a future meeting. And now let's return to our conversation about dysfunctional boards with David Nygren. I don't know if you saw it in the paper the other day, but there was a story about the travails of a very large and prominent board that had over 100 members, and much of its activity was done by the executive committee. Is there a level of board size where dysfunction is more likely to occur than not, or is it irrelevant to the consideration?
Well, there's research that says that size doesn't matter in relation to the board composition. However, I disagree with that because of the social psychological theory that the larger the group, the greater the diffusion of responsibility. So when you have a large group, 20, 30, 40, 100, you have the diffusion of responsibility where no one actually feels in a position where they must take charge, they must lead, they must guide, they must govern, they must make hard decisions, they must set policy. So large boards, to me, are problematic, actually. Now, I've seen university boards, I've seen theater boards, I've seen even hospital boards that are large that either confuse governance with philanthropy, or they are large because they're not willing to make the hard choices to downsize to a reasonably organized board that allows for good discussion, clear decisions, and tight policy shaping.
What are the warning signs, David? What would you tell your client about, when you should jump in as a board chair, as a CEO, as a general counsel? What's the time for intervention?
I'm often asked, Michael, to come into a board that the CEO or the chairman might say, it just doesn't feel right. I've got breaches of confidentiality. I have small groups maneuvering within the board to control its outcome. I question the board's ability. I think I don't have the right board to meet our strategic objectives. And when told that, oftentimes the presenting problem is not the real problem. And I go into every conversation with the board trying to understand what is the real problem here. Is it structural? Is it personal? Is it procedural? Is it legal? Is it deliberate attempts to undermine? What is the underlying problem? So being very clear, and sometimes that's why it's helpful to have outside advisors like McDermott to come in and just assess what's actually going on here. The chairman should be observing very carefully how people are interacting around the board table. The chairman ought to also control, or the lead director control, the degree to which any voice is dominating or not fully represented. It might come down as clearly to listen to the chatter at the coffee break or in the bathroom or in the parking lot. You'll often hear what the real concerns are outside of the formality of it. I'd also, as chairman of a couple boards, I observe committees as they do their work. I want to make sure that they engaged in focused, value-added conversation and not get too engaged in micromanagement or get too concerned or worried about another committee's charge and charter. That can create bad will, it can create tension. I also pay very strong attention to inclusion and exclusion dynamics. That might be gender dynamics, racial dynamics, it might be the old-timers versus the newcomers. It could be any number of tensions that can exist in any natural grouping of people. But sensitivity to inclusion and exclusion might direct you to the source of the problem. The other concern that I often have is making sure that policies and procedures through the General Counsel are put in place for legitimate intervention and, if necessary, removal of a director. We often see this language, that behavior is unbecoming of a director or a trustee. Unbecoming behavior is code for trouble. So I think we need in our bylaws or in our statutes or in our governance assessment to have an ability to remove someone who is not functional. That dysfunction might be disruptive personality. It might be lack of attention. It might be lack of preparedness. It might be missing meetings. Whatever the reason why a person is not fully functional has got to be addressed, and hopefully by the chairman of the governance committee, so that the board doesn't stand the consequence of this unbecoming behavior.
And just to wrap up, David, because I wanted to close with where you were headed, whose responsibility really is it within the leadership team? Is it the CEO? Is it the board chair, the governance committee chair, the general counsel? Who picks up the phone and is really responsible for calling you in?
It can be any one of those four individuals. I would say that the majority of the time it's the consensus of those four, general counsel, CEO, lead director, chairman of the governance committee, or the chairman of the board, to say, we have a problem here, we've tried to address it, we're not successful at addressing it. And so they might call me in, and again, what is the real problem? You have to assess that very carefully so you don't misdiagnose and then treat the wrong symptom. As I mentioned, major change might be in the composition of the board. I've recently gone through a redesign of a board back east that has required, its strategic direction requires an entirely newly composed board, which meant reducing the size to an appropriate 14 out of 30, and we had to go through a process of recomposing that very thoughtfully without injury to anyone's person or business. It might be a structural flaw, as I mentioned. It might be a leadership flaw that you got the wrong persons in either leadership positions, chairing positions. It might be a cultural factor when you merge companies or corporations or institutions together. There may be a cultural clash that needs to be addressed. It might be as simple as an agenda flaw where you're not allowing sufficient time to do the hard work. So when the general counsel calls, it's often around the procedural rights and duties of the board, and for some reason it's just not working, and we need some help to assess that. Now, I think the remedies for these types of dysfunctions are, one, as required for public companies, is an annual board review, committee review, and assessing really how well are we functioning as a group, and are we really making significant decisions? Are we adding value? Another way of doing this is through peer review, where directors review their own performance personally, but also review the performance of one another. good chairmen love to have routine feedback on their performance, and I recommend this at the end of every single board meeting, to have a little checklist where the chairman asks, how well did we do? How well did the CEO do? How significant and important and meaningful were the reports that were presented? You might hire somebody from outside to do an in-boardroom evaluation or observation and then feedback. That's often very helpful in solving not massive problems, but nevertheless consequential concerns that board members have. And then finally, it's often the case where I would personally do coaching for either chairman who want to learn to do things in a new and different way, or a CEO who, by virtue of perhaps newness to a role or particular problems he observes or she observes in the boardroom, might invite me to coach him to structure things in a different way. So there are many remedies, but diagnosing the real concern is fundamental.
David, this has been terrific, and I know is a fabulous interest to many of our clients. We're going to have you back because my notepad is full of questions I want to ask you, and we're out of time. Can you come back in a couple of months and we'll pick up where we left off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David, very much. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
As David has just told us, there's much that boards can do to recognize and respond to indications of board dysfunction at both the individual director and full board levels. Dysfunction poses a significant organizational risk, is contrary to core fiduciary principles, and thus requires a thoughtful, if not also swift, board response. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode of Governing Health. Be sure to subscribe to the full complimentary podcast series. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. There you'll be able to stay up to date with all our future episodes and to re-listen to the old ones. Until next time, I'm your host, Michael Peregrine.
Any use of these materials, including reproduction, modification, distribution, or republication without the prior written consent of McDermott, Will & Emery is strictly prohibited. This may be considered attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.